David woke up early in the morning, long before the sun had painted the sky with light. His small apartment was quiet, filled only with the faint hum of traffic outside. The cracked walls and old furniture told the story of his life, simple, worn down, yet full of resilience. He sat at the edge of his bed, rubbing his tired eyes, and for a moment, he let himself dream of a different future. He often imagined what it would be like to live without worry, to work not just for survival but for passion. But as quickly as the dream came, he brushed it aside. Bills had to be paid, and his shift at the airport started soon. He grabbed his faded work jacket, the one with grease stains that never washed out, and stepped into the cool morning air. At the airport, the world was already awake. Planes roared in the distance, workers moved quickly across the grounds, and radios buzzed with constant chatter. For most people, an airport was a place of excitement and wealth, a place where powerful people traveled in luxury. For David, it was simply his workplace. He had worked there for years as a mechanic, repairing small planes, servicing cargo machines, and sometimes helping out with older private jets that other engineers did not want to touch. He was known for his steady hands and sharp mind, yet he was never celebrated. His paycheck was modest, and while others sometimes went home to big houses and new cars, David walked back each night to his small apartment. Despite the struggles, he loved engines. To him, every machine had a soul, a rhythm, and a voice. When something was wrong, he could almost feel it before opening the panels. His co-workers often laughed and said he had magic in his fingers, but they rarely respected him beyond that. Many saw him only as the black mechanic who worked hard but remained stuck at the bottom. Still, David kept his head down and worked. He knew bitterness would not fix his life, but hope might, even if that hope was hidden deep inside. On this particular morning, something felt different. David could not explain it, but the air carried a certain weight, a quiet tension. As he entered the hangar, he noticed the unusual activity. People rushed across the floor, supervisors barked orders, and a sense of urgency floated everywhere. David changed into his work gear and went to his usual corner, but the noise around him kept pulling his attention. Something big was happening. While tightening a bolt on a small engine, he overheard two senior mechanics talking. "It's her jet," one whispered. "She just landed and there's a problem." "Can you believe it?" "The billionaire herself." David lifted his head. They were talking about Evelyn Carter, one of the most powerful women in the business world. He had read about her in newspapers, seen her face on television, and heard endless stories of her brilliance and strict personality. She was a woman who made empires move, who made decisions that shaped markets, and who traveled the world in luxury. And now, apparently, her jet had broken down right on their runway. The senior engineers were nervous. None of them wanted to be responsible for the repair. "If something goes wrong, it's on us," one muttered. "Better to wait for her personal team." Others nodded, agreeing it was too risky. The jet was worth millions, and a mistake could ruin reputations. David listened quietly, his mind turning. He was not part of their circle, not trusted with important tasks like this. He was usually given the jobs no one else wanted. Dirty, thankless, invisible work. Yet something inside him stirred. A loud announcement came through the radio, confirming that Evelyn's jet was grounded. Workers whispered in corners, pointing toward the runway. David put down his wrench and stepped outside. The sight struck him. There it was, a sleek, shining private jet, elegant and powerful, yet sitting helpless on the tarmac. Security guards surrounded it, and Evelyn herself stood nearby, dressed in a sharp suit, speaking firmly into her phone. Even from a distance, her presence was undeniable. She looked like a woman who commanded the world, and now her machine had failed her. David's heart beat faster. He knew he had the skill. He knew engines like this were not beyond his reach. But he also knew how the world worked. People like him were not expected to step forward in moments like this. People like him were supposed to stay in the background, waiting for orders. Still, he could not ignore the call within. His hands, those same hands that had fixed countless engines, itched to touch that jet, to bring it back to life. One of the supervisors spotted him standing nearby. "David, what are you doing out here?" "Get back to your section," the man barked. David hesitated, then spoke softly but firmly. "I can fix it." The supervisor laughed, shaking his head. "You? Don't be foolish. This isn't some old cargo plane. This is worth more than your whole life. Stay out of the way," but David did not move. His eyes remained locked on the jet. Something inside him refused to step back. He felt a strange mix of fear and courage, as if destiny itself had brought him to this point. He thought of the long years of struggle, of being unseen, of carrying a gift no one fully valued. Maybe this was his chance. Maybe this was the moment when all the unseen work, all the sleepless nights would finally matter. The whispers grew louder. Some workers mocked him, saying he would ruin everything. Others looked curious, wondering if he really dared. Evelyn glanced in his direction, her eyes sharp and questioning. For a brief moment, their gazes met. She saw a mechanic in a stained uniform standing apart from the others, yet with an unusual fire in his eyes. David felt his throat tighten, but he did not look away. Then came the sound, the roar of engines in the distance, planes waiting for clearance, the growing urgency of schedules breaking down. Evelyn's jet had to be repaired quickly, or she would miss her critical meeting. Pressure weighed heavy on everyone, but no one stepped forward. No one except David. He took a deep breath and began walking toward the jet. Each step felt heavier than the last, but he kept moving. Workers muttered behind him. Security guards eyed him cautiously, but he ignored them. He reached the edge of the plane where the ground crew stood frozen. "Let me try," he said. His voice was calm, steady, carrying a quiet confidence. For a moment, no one moved. Then Evelyn herself lowered her phone and spoke, her voice clear and strong. "Can you really fix it?" David's heart raced, but his answer came without hesitation. Yes. The air went silent. Everyone stared at him, waiting for her reply. Evelyn studied his face, searching for something, truth, courage, skill. Then slowly she nodded. "Do it." And with that single word, the door to David's destiny opened. He rolled up his sleeves, gathered his tools, and approached the jet with steady hands. The world around him faded. The doubts disappeared, and only the engine remained before him. It was no longer just a machine, it was his chance, his test, his moment to rise. David knelt near the shining jet, his hands steady as he laid his tools beside him. Around him, the crowd of mechanics, ground staff, and security guards stood in silence, watching with a mix of doubt and curiosity. The pressure was heavy, like a weight pressing down on his shoulders, but inside his heart was steady. For years he had worked quietly in the background, fixing small engines, solving problems others ignored. This time was different. This time all eyes were on him, and failure was not an option. The billionaire Evelyn Carter remained a few steps away. She was still holding her phone, but now her attention was fixed on David. There was something in her eyes, curiosity mixed with suspicion. She was a woman used to excellence, someone who demanded perfection. She had no time for excuses or half-done work. To her, a person was either capable or useless, and David knew it. He could feel her gaze like a sharp blade at his back, testing him, judging him. Yet strangely, that did not make him nervous. Instead, it gave him focus. He wanted to prove himself, not just to her but to the entire world that had always doubted him. David ran his hands over the side of the engine, listening to the faint sound it made when touched. Every machine spoke in its own way, and he had learned to hear it when others could not. He opened the panel, ignoring the gasps behind him. The engine's insides looked complicated and intimidating, but to him it was like reading a book he had already studied many times. He spotted signs of overheating, loose wiring, and a clogged fuel valve. The problems were serious but not impossible. He knew exactly what to do. The head supervisor walked forward, clearly irritated. "Step away," he demanded in a harsh tone. "You are not authorized to touch this. If something goes wrong, do you realize what will happen?"
"You'll cost us our jobs, all of us."
David looked up briefly, his eyes calm. "It will be worse if we do nothing. She needs this jet ready now. I can fix it. Trust me." The supervisor was about to argue, but Evelyn raised her hand. Her voice was calm but firm. "Let him continue. Every second we waste arguing is another second lost." The supervisor stepped back, grumbling under his breath, but no one else dared to interfere. David returned to the engine, moving quickly yet carefully. His fingers worked with precision, loosening bolts, tightening others, checking lines, and clearing the valve. Sweat rolled down his forehead, but his expression never broke. To him, the noise around, the whispers, the doubts, the tension had faded away. The world had narrowed to one thing, the engine in front of him. Minutes stretched like hours. Evelyn checked her watch impatiently, knowing her international meeting was growing closer with each passing moment. Her security chief leaned in, whispering, "Ma'am, perhaps we should call your personal team from New York. This is too risky." She shook her head slowly. Her eyes stayed on David. No. Something tells me he can do it. David crawled deeper under the jet, his uniform streaked with oil and dirt. The tools in his hands clinked and clattered as he tightened the last connections. The fuel line was cleared, the wiring adjusted, and the engine carefully reset. He paused, wiping his brow, and then gave a small nod to himself. He knew it was ready. He stepped back, motioning to one of the ground crew. "Start her up," he said firmly. The worker hesitated. "Are you sure?" David looked at him with quiet confidence. "Yes, do it." The man climbed inside the cockpit, turning the ignition. For a moment, silence filled the air. Then came the deep rumble, followed by a sudden, powerful roar as the engine sprang back to life. The sound echoed across the runway, strong and steady. The jet's body shook with energy, no longer lifeless but alive again. The crowd gasped. Mechanics who had doubted him stood frozen, their eyes wide with shock. Some shook their heads, unable to believe that David, the man they often ignored, had brought the billionaire's jet back in minutes when no one else dared to try. Evelyn's expression changed. The cold suspicion in her eyes softened into admiration. She took a step closer, her gaze fixed on David as though seeing him for the first time. "You did it," she said softly, almost to herself. Then louder, "You actually did it." David wiped his hands with a rag, trying to hide the small smile that wanted to escape. "It was only an engine problem. Nothing I haven't seen before." But Evelyn shook her head. "No, it wasn't just an engine. It was a test of courage, of skill, and of trust. And you passed." Her words carried weight. The workers around them shifted uncomfortably, realizing that their billionaire client was now praising the very man they had mocked and underestimated for so long. David stood quietly, not used to such attention, but inside his heart swelled with a mix of pride and relief. The security chief spoke again, clearly trying to pull Evelyn away. "Ma'am, your schedule." She silenced him with a single glance. Then she turned back to David. "What is your name?" "David," he replied simply. "Well, David," she said, her voice softer now, "you've done more than fix a machine today. You've reminded me that true talent often hides in the most unexpected places." The mechanics whispered among themselves. Some looked at David with respect for the first time, while others were still stunned into silence. Evelyn continued to study him, her eyes filled with thought. There was no arrogance in David's posture, no boast in his words. He stood there humbly, yet there was something about his presence that was impossible to ignore. As the jet continued to roar powerfully, Evelyn's heart began to stir with something she had not felt in years. She admired courage, she admired strength, but above all she admired honesty and humility. And in that moment, on a crowded runway, she saw all of it standing in front of her in the form of a mechanic who had been overlooked all his life. The world around them seemed to fade as Evelyn's curiosity turned into something deeper. She wanted to know more. Who was this man who had dared to step forward when everyone else stepped back? Who was this man who carried such skill yet wore it so humbly? David, unaware of the thoughts racing in her mind, only nodded respectfully and began packing up his tools. To him, the job was done, and that was enough. But to Evelyn, it was just the beginning of something far greater than either of them could imagine. The roar of the jet's engine still echoed across the runway as David stepped back, wiping his hands on a rag that was already dark with grease and oil. For him, it was just another repair. Difficult, yes, but not impossible. For everyone else watching, it was nothing short of a miracle. Men who had been in the business for decades could hardly believe what they had just witnessed. Some stood in silence, others shook their heads, and a few muttered quietly that he had been lucky. But David knew it wasn't luck. It was years of hard work, long nights, and the kind of skill that came from experience no book could teach. Evelyn Carter did not move for a moment. She stood near her security team, her sharp eyes fixed on David as if trying to read him. She was a woman who dealt with leaders, politicians, and powerful figures every day, yet something about this humble mechanic held her attention. There was no arrogance in the way he stood, no pride in his expression. He simply looked relieved, almost shy, as though he wanted nothing more than to return to his corner of the airport and vanish again. That humility was rare in the world she lived in, where everyone seemed desperate to prove themselves. The security chief leaned closer to her. "Ma'am, the jet is ready. We should leave before the delay becomes too great." But Evelyn raised her hand slightly, keeping her eyes on David. "Not yet," she said. Her tone left no room for argument. David felt the weight of her gaze but tried not to show it. He packed his tools carefully, placing each one in its proper place the way he always did. In his world, tools were not just metal objects. They were extensions of his hands, partners in the silent conversations he had with engines. When he finished, he turned and prepared to walk back to the hangar. He had no idea that his life was about to change forever. "Wait!" Evelyn's voice rang out across the runway. David stopped in his tracks. Slowly, he turned around, unsure if she was speaking to him. The way her eyes locked on his told him she was. The workers and ground crew turned too, shocked that she was addressing him directly. "Come here," she said simply. David hesitated. He had never been called forward by someone like her before. But there was something in her voice, not a command, but an invitation. He walked slowly, each step echoing in the quiet tension of the moment. When he reached her, he kept his head slightly lowered, unsure how to hold himself in front of a billionaire whose name was known all around the world. "What's your full name?" she asked. "David Miller," he replied quietly. Her eyes studied him closely. "David Miller, the man who just saved me hours of delay and possibly millions of dollars." David shifted uncomfortably. "I only did my job, ma'am." She tilted her head. "No, others refused. Others feared failure. You stepped forward when no one else would. That is not just doing your job. That is courage." The words felt heavy to him, too grand for someone like himself. He lowered his eyes, embarrassed. "Thank you," he murmured. The mechanics nearby whispered furiously, astonished at how the conversation was unfolding. Never before had they seen someone like Evelyn Carter, a woman of such stature, speak this way to one of their own. Some felt jealous, others proud, but all of them knew they were witnessing something unusual. Evelyn took a step closer. "Tell me, David, how long have you worked here?" "Almost 10 years, he answered. "And in those 10 years, how many times have they let you take on a job this important?" David hesitated before speaking. "None. I usually get the smaller work. The routine maintenance." Her expression hardened slightly as she glanced at the supervisor standing awkwardly in the distance. They avoided her gaze, knowing what she was thinking. It was clear that they had overlooked him, perhaps even intentionally. David quickly added, "It's fine. I don't mind. Work is work. I'm grateful to have it," but Evelyn shook her head. "No, it is not fine. Talent like yours should not be wasted in shadows. People who carry courage and skill deserve more than invisibility." Her words struck something deep inside David. For years, he had buried his disappointment, convincing himself that humility was enough, that it was better to be grateful than to hope for more. Yet hearing her say this, hearing someone finally recognize what he had long felt inside, stirred emotions he did not know how to control. Before he could respond, the security chief interrupted again. "Ma'am, if we do not leave soon, you will miss the meeting in London." Evelyn glanced at her watch, then back at David. To everyone's surprise, she did not rush. Instead, she asked another question. "Do you enjoy what you do?" David thought for a moment. "Yes," he said honestly. "I love fixing engines. Machines make sense to me when nothing else does. But sometimes I wonder if this is all my life will ever be." The honesty in his words silenced the air around them. Evelyn felt something shift inside her. She had met thousands of men, ambitious men, clever men, wealthy men, but few who spoke with such sincerity. He was not trying to impress her. He was simply telling the truth. She smiled faintly, a rare expression for her. "Sometimes, David, life changes in a single moment. You never know when it will come." David did not fully understand her meaning, but he nodded respectfully. He expected the conversation to end there. Perhaps she would thank him again and walk away. Perhaps she would forget him the moment she stepped onto her jet. That would have been natural. People like her did not remember people like him. But Evelyn Carter was not like others. She turned to her team. "Give me a moment alone," she said. They looked stunned. The security chief hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but she repeated the order more firmly. One by one they stepped back, leaving her standing with David in the middle of the runway. For a long moment there was silence. The engines hummed in the background, the crowd kept their distance, and the wind swept softly across the tarmac. Evelyn studied him again, as though searching for something she could not quite name. "You're a remarkable man, David," she said finally, "and not because you fixed my jet. It's because of the way you did it, without fear, without ego, with nothing but determination. I respect that more than you know." David felt his cheeks grow warm. Compliments were rare in his life, especially ones like this. "I just did what had to be done," he said softly. Evelyn's eyes held his for a long moment. There was no wall between them now, no divide of wealth or status. Just two people standing on the same ground, seeing each other clearly for the first time. She wanted to say more, but she held back. Instead, she gave him one last look and said, "I will not forget you, David Miller." And with that, she turned and walked toward the jet. The crowd parted for her as they always did, but David remained rooted to the spot, his heart pounding. He had no idea why her words felt so heavy, why they echoed in his chest as though they carried a secret promise. All he knew was that something inside him had shifted, something that would never go back to the way it was before. The jet roared louder as it prepared for takeoff, and David stood there watching until it disappeared into the sky. Only then did he gather his tools and walk back to the hangar, unaware that his life had just stepped into a story that would astonish the world. David could not sleep that night. He lay on his old bed, staring at the cracked ceiling of his apartment, the sound of the jet's roar still echoing in his mind. The moment kept replaying over and over, the engine coming back to life, the crowd's shocked faces, and above all, Evelyn Carter's eyes as she told him she would not forget him. Those words carried a weight that pressed on his chest. For years he had lived in the shadows, ignored by most, forgotten by nearly all. Now a billionaire, someone so far above his world it was almost unreal, had seen him. He closed his eyes, but instead of sleep, he saw her face. Strong, confident, and yet softened when she spoke to him. It made him wonder if maybe she was not as untouchable as the newspapers painted her to be. Still, he shook his head and whispered to himself, "She's a billionaire. You're just a mechanic. Don't dream too much." But deep down he could not stop his heart from holding on to that spark of hope. The next morning at the airport, things were different. Everywhere he walked, eyes followed him. Some workers nodded in respect, others whispered in jealousy, and a few tried to act as though nothing had changed. His supervisor, who once barked orders without a glance, now spoke to him more carefully. "Good work yesterday," he muttered awkwardly, as if the words burned his tongue. David only nodded, refusing to show pride. He had learned long ago that humility kept a man safe. But inside he felt something new, dignity. For the first time, he believed his work mattered. As the day went on, whispers spread like fire. Evelyn Carter's name floated through the halls. Some claimed she had praised David in front of the entire staff. Others swore she had delayed her meeting just to talk to him. The stories twisted into rumors, and the more they spread, the more surreal they became. David tried to ignore it, focusing on his tasks, but a part of him knew this was only the beginning. Late in the afternoon, as he was finishing work on a cargo plane, a black car pulled up near the hangar. It was sleek and polished, clearly belonging to someone important. Everyone paused to watch. The driver stepped out, dressed in a sharp uniform, and walked straight toward David. "Mr. Miller?" the man asked politely. David blinked in confusion. "Yes?" "You are requested," the driver said simply, "by Ms. Evelyn Carter." The words dropped like stones in the air. Mechanics and workers turned their heads, jaws dropping. Some laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke. Others stared at David with disbelief. But the driver's serious tone and the car waiting outside told them it was real. David's heart raced. He wiped his hands nervously on his rag. "Are you sure?" he asked, almost whispering. The driver gave a small nod. "Yes, sir. She asked for you personally." The word "sir" sounded strange in David's ears. He wasn't used to anyone calling him that. His co-workers whispered louder now, some in envy, others in shock. Without another word, David followed the driver. The car ride was silent, yet David's mind raced louder than ever. Why would she call for him? What could a billionaire possibly want from a man like him? He sat stiffly in the back seat, afraid to relax, staring out at the busy city streets. Every turn of the wheel brought him closer to something unknown. Finally, the car stopped in front of a grand hotel near the city's center. The kind of place David had only ever seen in magazines. Crystal lights shone from the windows. Golden doors opened automatically, and valets in fine suits rushed to greet guests. David felt out of place in his worn jacket and work boots. He hesitated, but the driver gestured for him to step out. Inside the hotel, everything sparkled. Marble floors, chandeliers, and walls covered in elegant art. People in expensive clothes walked gracefully, barely glancing at him. David kept his head down, following the driver until they reached a private dining room. The door opened, and there she was, Evelyn Carter, sitting at a long table with only one empty chair across from her. "David," she said warmly, rising to her feet. "I'm glad you came." His throat felt dry. "Ms. Carter," he replied softly. "Please." She gestured to the chair. "Sit." He lowered himself carefully into the seat, feeling small in such luxury. She studied him with the same sharp yet gentle eyes from the runway. For a moment she said nothing, letting the silence draw him in. Then she spoke. "I had many choices yesterday," she began. "I could have called my team from New York. I could have waited for another expert. But I trusted you, and you proved yourself." David shifted uncomfortably. "I only did what I knew, ma'am." Her lips curved into a small smile. "That humility of yours, it's rare. Most men would have bragged by now. But you don't. You remind me of someone who knows the true value of work." He looked down at his hands. "Work is all I've ever had." She leaned forward slightly. "Tell me about your life, David. Who are you beyond the mechanic everyone else sees?" The question caught him off guard. No one had ever asked him that before. He hesitated, then spoke quietly. He told her about his childhood, about growing up with little, about losing his parents early and having to fight for every step of survival. He told her about the nights he went hungry, the days he worked odd jobs just to afford his training, and how he ended up at the airport, grateful to be near the machines he loved. Evelyn listened without interrupting, her eyes never leaving his face. She wasn't just hearing his words. She was absorbing them, and with each sentence her respect for him grew. When he finished, silence hung in the air. Evelyn finally spoke, her voice softer now. "You've lived a life of struggle, yet here you are standing tall. Do you realize how rare that is? Strength like yours is not found in wealth or titles. It's found in the heart." David's chest tightened at her words. He wanted to argue, to tell her he wasn't special, but something in her eyes silenced him. He realized she truly meant it. Just then dinner was served. Plates of fine food, unlike anything David had tasted before, were placed in front of him. He hesitated, unsure of how to act, but Evelyn smiled and said, "Eat. Tonight you're not just a mechanic. Tonight you're my guest." As they ate, the conversation deepened. Evelyn spoke of her own life, the endless meetings, the battles in boardrooms, the constant fight to stay ahead. "People think being a billionaire means happiness," she admitted. "But most days it feels like being in a cage of gold, surrounded by wealth yet starved of honesty." David looked at her, surprised. He had never imagined someone like her could feel lonely. "You," she continued, her eyes locking on his, "were the first person in a long time to speak to me without fear, without agenda. Do you understand how rare that is?" David swallowed hard, unsure how to answer. His hands trembled slightly as he held his glass of water. All he could manage was, "I didn't mean to be special. I just wanted to help." Evelyn's gaze softened. "And that is why you are special." The evening stretched on, filled with stories, laughter, and a connection neither expected. By the time David returned to his apartment that night, his world no longer felt the same. He lay in bed again, staring at the ceiling, but this time he wasn't haunted by struggle. He was filled with wonder. A billionaire had not only remembered him, but had seen him, listened to him, and valued him, and deep inside, though he would not yet admit it to himself, David knew something powerful was beginning, something that might change both of their lives forever. The next day began like any other, but David woke with a strange energy coursing through him. The memory of sitting across from Evelyn Carter in that elegant hotel still felt like a dream. He could hardly believe it had happened. A man like him eating fine food, speaking with one of the most powerful women in the world. It was something he never imagined. Yet it was real. Her words still echoed in his ears. "You were the first person in a long time to speak to me without fear." At the airport, whispers about him had only grown louder. Workers stared as he walked by. Some gave him small nods of respect, while others muttered in jealousy. David tried to focus on his tasks, but his heart was restless. He knew Evelyn hadn't spoken empty words. She was a woman who meant everything she said, and he couldn't shake the feeling that their paths would cross again. By late afternoon, the sound of engines filled the sky. A familiar, sleek jet touched down on the runway, the same one he had repaired just a day earlier. Ground crews scrambled, supervisors rushed to give orders, but everyone looked to David now. Somehow he had become the quiet center of attention. The door of the jet opened and Evelyn stepped out. This time she wasn't in a rush, nor did she carry the heavy expression of business. She looked composed, confident as always, yet her eyes searched the crowd until they found him. Without hesitation, she walked directly toward him. Workers froze in disbelief, their mouths half open. Billionaires did not walk across greasy runways to approach mechanics, but here she was. "Doing exactly that, David," she said warmly, her voice carrying over the hum of the tarmac. He quickly wiped his hands on his rag, his heart racing. "Miss Carter." "Evelyn," she corrected gently with a small smile. "After last night, I think you've earned the right to call me by my name." The crowd whispered louder, astonished at her words. David shifted uncomfortably under their stares. "Evelyn," he repeated softly, the name feeling strange yet powerful on his tongue. She stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "Do you know why I came back today?" He shook his head. "I don't. Because I realized something yesterday," she said. "In my world, I am surrounded by wealth, luxury, and power. But none of it means anything without honesty and courage. Yesterday, on this very runway, you showed me both. And last night, you reminded me what true strength looks like." David felt his chest tighten. He glanced at the workers nearby, all staring in silence, then back at her. "I'm just a mechanic," he said quietly. "No," she replied firmly. "You are far more than that." Then, to the shock of everyone present, Evelyn reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small box. Gasps filled the air as she opened it, revealing a gleaming ring that sparkled under the setting sun. The entire runway seemed to go still. David's breath caught in his throat. "What are you doing?" he whispered, his hands trembling. She smiled, her eyes steady and full of determination. "David Miller, you may see yourself as just a mechanic, but I see a man of courage, humility, and heart. In a world full of masks, you are real, and I value that more than anything money can buy." She held out the ring. "So I'm asking you here and now, will you marry me?" The crowd erupted into gasps and whispers, some even covering their mouths in disbelief. Workers, guards, and staff who had spent years ignoring David now stood frozen, their eyes wide with shock. David felt his legs weaken. He had faced broken engines, sleepless nights, and endless struggles, but never had he faced something like this. He looked at her, the billionaire, the woman who could have anyone, choosing him in front of the world. His heart raced so fast he thought it might burst. His voice broke, his throat tight. He searched her eyes, looking for any sign that this was a joke or pity. But all he saw was sincerity, shining bright and unshakable. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, but it was not heavy. It was freeing. For the first time in his life, he felt truly seen, truly valued. Slowly he nodded, his voice barely above a whisper, but strong enough for her to hear. "Yes." The crowd gasped again, followed by a wave of stunned applause. Mechanics cheered. Guards smiled despite themselves, and even the supervisors stood with tears in their eyes. Cameras flashed from bystanders who had caught the unbelievable scene. Evelyn's smile widened, and without hesitation, she slipped the ring onto his finger. Then, before the stunned eyes of hundreds, she leaned forward and kissed him softly on the runway. The crowd roared with shock and celebration. David stood there dazed, his heart soaring higher than any plane he had ever touched. The world around him had changed forever. Yesterday, he had been just another forgotten worker. Today, he was the man chosen by a billionaire, not for his status but for his soul. The story would spread everywhere, headlines screaming about the billionaire who proposed to a mechanic on the runway. But for David, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the truth that love, respect, and destiny had found him when he least expected it. And as the sun dipped behind the horizon, painting the sky in gold, David and Evelyn walked off the runway together. Two lives once worlds apart, now united in a story that would be remembered for generations.